Hey there, YouTubers, right? So in this video, I'm going to talk about what have I learned about 13th Gen. This is revision 4. So originally released this, then I made a bunch of updates via links. Now I'm just going to release it again. So interesting enough, folks, I've had the i5 13600kf, i7 13700K, and the i9 13900kf. As I've had those and used different motherboards and CPU coolers and different graphics cards, etc., etc. One thing that's amazed me, temps have been all over the place. All right, let's talk about that first. So Intel 13th Gen temperatures. I kind of felt like, have I lost my mind? Why is it that one CPU cooler combo is 20 degrees higher in gaming or thermal throttles and benchmarks, or the idle speed is higher uh, depending on which motherboard I use. Now, an example, MSI Pro Z690A, I think it is, and my Aorus Extreme or Elite AX Z690. The MSI Pro thermal throttles and benchmarks, gaming is in the low 70s, but the Aorus gaming's in the 50s and it doesn't thermal throttle. And so motherboard choice does matter, folks. Now, will it matter as much later as they do more BIOS updates? Maybe, maybe not. But there are definitely some Z690s, in my opinion, to steer away from. And that would also include, probably all of the other 600 motherboards that are related to those. Okay. Now, how do you get those temps down? This is not all inclusive, but some things to check. Right. Verify you have installed CPU cooler components correctly. Verify that the thermal paste is on there. So if you have extra thermal paste and you're getting high temps, remove your CPU cooler. Make sure that it's spread, that you don't have a big dot in the middle that's just been, slightly smeared around or whatever, pressed down. You want, that thermal paste to basically be covering that CPU, right? And if it's not, maybe you don't have all the fasteners tightened. Maybe you're using some of the wrong components from your box. Maybe you have, if you have like a Noctua D15 and you have dual towers, dual fans, maybe you have the fans blowing the wrong way, or maybe you have the fans blowing against each other. Lots of different things you could be doing wrong. Now, potential thing you could look at that costs money, a better CPU cooler, right? Do you need to upgrade to a 420? That's another story. You may need a better case just based on your CPU cooler selection. Better case, usually means better airflow, right? More volume in there. Depending on how the vent is in the front, you may get better laminar flow versus turbulent flow. You may get a greater quantity of airflow depending on how many fans you have in there. Lots of things, that can be done. You may also get a noisier case because you have all those fans. Power limits, knowing how to adjust those. Maybe you have them adjusted too high, but really this matters more with benchmarks and not so much with gaming. Now, you may see in benchmarks that your power limit throttling, hence why you've adjusted your power limits. But then you may have adjusted them too high for benchmarks and it's getting too hot. So one of the simplest things to do to really drop temperature is to disable turbo boost. I use a software called Throttle Stop, but usually in your BIOS somewhere is the ability to enable or disable turbo boost. Turbo boost is enabled by default. Okay. Now, what does this do? Well, it drops the ability to hit those higher frequencies down to something like 3 gigahertz, and so that has a positive effect as far as temperatures go and less power being used. But on the negative side, performance is affected. All right. Now, if you're running an i9-13900kf Fortnite, 1440p with a RTX 3090, you're getting ridiculous, frame rates, and you're still going to get ridiculous frame rates, but not quite the same. Adjusting multiplier. So this is kind of somewhere between default and disabling turbo boost. You may have to adjust other settings, but you could drop down. So if you have all your multipliers at 53, you could drop them down to 39 and be somewhere in between default and disabling turbo boost. You may notice a 5 to 10 degree temperature difference, or it may be less. It's interesting how that sometimes really helps and sometimes you don't see as much. Undervolting, I say use this as a last resort. This, we'll talk about more detail later, but this can be used to significantly drop temperatures as well. Maybe buy some better thermal paste. Ensure you have used the adequate amount. So that's an important thing there too. Motherboards, all right. Um, if you want less headaches, folks, buy the Z790 or the Future 700 series motherboards. You will save yourself headaches, I believe, from the 600 series. They're more expensive, but one of the things, hey, if you buy a 600 series motherboard and you have to update the BIOS and it doesn't have the ability to have the BIOS updated without a CPU installed, then the cost of that Celeron, let's say you buy, plus the cost of the Z690 is going to equal the price of the Z790. Definitely look for 600 series motherboards that can allow you to update without a CPU installed, graphics card, or RAM. This video here demonstrates it. We have 24 pin connected, and we don't really need this one, and it doesn't show you the thumb drive, but that's really all. This power switch over here isn't needed, and that makes life so much easier. Still not as good as Z790. Later on, if you're watching this and it's say May 2022 or 23, December 2023, read the reviews on Amazon. They may help you whether the motherboards are shipping with updated BIOS, because it can take a while till they get rid of the older ones. I say avoid lower end motherboards. Definitely avoid H610M for these overclockable 700, overclockable 13th gen CPUs. I kind of stay away from ASRock and BioStar, at least for the cheaper B660Ms. Most of the other stuff is decent, but the real cheap stuff gonna most likely have low quality VRMs, non-existent heat sinks, or weak power stages. You may not be able to power limit, so if you're getting power limit throttling notices, then that is one of the aspects of the cheaper motherboards. And of course, you won't be able to overclock. Now, looking at motherboards more, prices. I haven't updated this really, but some of the Z790s start at 179. Better quality stuff maybe 260. Z690s that are, in my opinion, are really good are usually right around $200. The cheaper stuff, is really dropped in value on eBay. You'll see people dumping them for 115, 120, and then B660s, used, right at that $100 or less mark. So BIOS updates might not fix all the problems. You may still experience lower performance or significantly less Cinebenchmarks. Make sure you read up on, hey, do I need to update my Intel management engine if you have an ASUS motherboard? You know, and you may find you have to adjust core voltage or undervolt. So that's an alternative. Whether that's such a great idea is another story, but that may get your CPU motherboard combo performing. I did this in one of the videos, and then later found out that ASUS had said, hey, we need you to update this to get this to perform right. So in the end, I still have lower scores with that ASUS. Don't expect all motherboards to perform equally. We'll talk about that here shortly. And voila. So here's a list of 13th gen that I've owned so far and used with 13th gen. I've had more Z690s and other LGA 1700 motherboards, but these have all seen a 13th gen CPU. So on the right, we've got an asterisk here. Can be updated without a CPU. Plus sign, 13th gen compatible out of the box. Well, out of all these, which ones currently are compatible right out of the box? That's only the Gigabyte Z790UD, and I have, sorry, the AC model. So I have green, yellow, red. Let's talk about the green. All of these, you know, I felt like had good temps, had good scores. They all could be updated without a CPU. So I looked at these very favorably. This one worked great with it after a BIOS update. Well, it does not have the ability to be updated without a CPU, okay? So that's why it's yellow. This one has the ability to be updated without a CPU, but the temps were terrible. And these two don't have the ability to be updated without a CPU, and they underperformed even after all the updates. So read up all the info on your motherboard. You know, Google, hey, why am I experiencing these problems? Somebody else may have found the problem, but you know, when you're doing your BIOS update, read everything it says. Like this says, you know, in the description, hey, you need to update your Intel management engine down here, so you install that. But then also always read all of the description of the BIOS updates and grab, you know, the most current BIOS update unless it tells you otherwise. CPU coolers. All right, let's talk about that. We already talked about making sure it's installed right, having good thermal paste. So originally when I did this, I thought, the i5's not going to have any problem with most of my Noctua coolers. Lo and behold, it did, but that was really dependent on the motherboard I was using, okay? Now, in the right motherboard, you'll not have any problem with the i5 13600kf and a Noctua NHU14S, right? So that's a single tower, 140 millimeter. So you should find others comparative to that. And I think the TDP on the Noctua is roughly 200 watts. So anything 200 watts or greater, you should be, you know, pretty happy with. Even the clone like the Thermalright Frost Commander 140, which is similar to the Noctua D14. Of course, you know, if you want to overclock, you may have to bump your CPU coolers up. You'll find that the benchmarks with, you know, these CPU coolers in the i5, they're much better than the i5 12600K and vicinity of the i9-12900. Temps are rather low during gaming or can be higher depending on which motherboard I've used, all right? Now, in the wrong motherboard, you will find that you could be thermal throttling i7. So it seemed like there was a significant difference in the temperatures between the i5 and the i7, but as I was originally testing my i5 with a better motherboard and the i7 was in an MSI Pro, I was thermal limit throttling all over the place. I tried a bunch of my best coolers, and I think even today, these would work great with this CPU if you had the right motherboard and you had good cooling and all the other aspects. Now, I don't think, everybody's going to have that great of luck, which is interesting, but that leads really to, hey, water coolers, potentially you don't want to have any problem. Go big on your water cooler, 360, 420. And I wish I could give you more advice there, but if you have an existing CPU cooler, try that out first with your motherboard CPU combo. Find out if it's running hot, and if it's not, then hey, you're good. If it is running hot, then you may have to upgrade. I wish there was a more definitive uh, information on what is causing this between my different motherboards. But now the i9, my i9 was running cooler than my i7, right? So that really told me that, hey, I've got something going on, and narrowed it down to certain motherboards. This thing has been amazing. Right now, I actually have it paired with a Noctua NHU14S, so I have two of those, and one is on the i5, one's on the i9, but it's worked great. Now, would I overclock with it? No, but it performs quite well. Now, I've also used the water coolers on it, the 280 millimeter and a 420. A lot of viewers were recommended 280 to 360, and I went 420, thinking, hey, maybe I can overclock this a little better. Undervolting. Now, what does that mean? It means to decrease the voltage reaching the processor and CPU with the goal of maintaining stability. Quite a few benefits, some negatives. I say, use this as a last resort. It may not work for everybody. You may change settings and nothing happens. So basically some of the benefits: can cool down the CPU temp, stop it from hitting thermal throttle, may idle less, may have lower temps in gaming. You know, thermal throttle, if you're existing thermal limit throttling, you're hitting performance loss with that, right? So eliminating that is a good thing. Now, you may not see that in gaming, right? Benchmarks, it matters in gaming. Unless you're hitting high 90s, you're not dealing with that. Maybe used to use existing CPU cooler or water without upgrading, so that could be a benefit. Can be done from within XTU and not have to be done inside the BIOS. You may find you increase overall scores. Now, whether it's because you've gotten rid of that thermal limit throttling issue, or you just fine tune your default settings and hit a higher score, which surprisingly can happen. Negatives: possible performance loss. So if you're having to undervolt, you may find that you're actually not getting a higher score. Instability. The worst thing that can happen is crashes. Like blue screen of death is not as bad as just a crash. Blue screen of death, usually, your computer comes back up after you restart it. How does this happen? Undervolting too much. If you're too aggressive, you may find it just completely crashes. And if it does crash, you may have to restart your computable multiple times, pull the CMOS battery, pull your drives out, just to get it to boot to BIOS and reset itself. And as mentioned, varying by motherboard, undervolting may or may not adjust, may not show any improvement with it which, you know, is another interesting thing. Let me just make sure we're still recording. All right. CPU frame. Talked about this previously. I got no benefit out of this with 13th Gen. Tried it in 3 different CPUs and different motherboards. I think this was a 12th Gen thing, or smoke and mirrors thing. Maybe they used cheap paste and then increased it with better paste, but I've never had. This did not help me, so maybe an i9-12900K it will work with, but all these components are expensive. CPUs are more expensive than last generation. Motherboards are more expensive. The if you need a CPU frame, it's more expensive. The coolers may end up being more expensive. You may not be able to use an existing one that you have. We talked about thermal paste, but Thermal Grizzly, has that CPU frame, and it's the most expensive. And does it do anything? Finally, folks, Windows 10 or 11. Yours truly has not seen any reason to upgrade to Windows 11 over Windows 10. Performance and everything I've seen is comparative. Some of the bigger YouTubers have noted better results with Win 10. So thanks for checking out my video. Please like, please